If you want to learn how to make view models and pass them through a web API, then stick around. So we're going to talk about creating view models. The challenge we face with using relational database stores is that the raw data is not good for viewing. For example, you can see here that we have a table with a bunch of foreign keys, which are just a bunch of numbers. And that is not good for a user to look at. And this comes into play because we store data in relational stores in a bunch of different tables, and then it forces us to gather them all together to put them into some sort of view that the user can make sense of. And this is accomplished by doing things like selecting and joining and grouping and aggregate functions. And in one way, shape, or form, we have to get the data from a bunch of different tables into some single collection that is viewable to somebody using a user interface. So we're going to talk about something called a view model. So a view model is just data in a format that you want to display. And it is not necessarily stored in the database that way. So let's look at a couple ways that we can create view models. So we have a couple different methods of creating view models. We can use stored procedures, views, and application code. So over here with stored procedures, they definitely have the best performance. However, they are difficult to work with entity framework. Takes a little bit of extra time to get them to be scaffolded in. Stored procedures can do all the CRUD operations, so you can create, read, update, and delete, and you can also pass in parameters and essentially treat it as a function, and it's definitely going to give you a big amount of reuse and flexibility. Over here we have views. These are very easy to use. They are view only, right? So we only have the read in CRUD. We don't have the ability to pass in parameters to a view, so large data can often be returned. And then of course we have doing all the view aggregation in the application code. Generally that's kind of frowned upon. That gets very complicated to do specific queries, especially if we're doing lots of joins. And it can be very inefficient, for example, if you have a DB call inside a loop. In this tutorial, we're actually going to look at views. So some of the good things about views is we can, some of the good things about views are that we can edit and test them in the database. We will still need to use some application code, and in this case we'll use LINQ. This would be okay for small apps. However, it is not going to be good for an application that has millions of records in a view that would be filtered down to simply a few records. So since we cannot pass parameters in, our filtering needs to be done usually in the application level. So it would not be practical once our data starts getting very large. The nice thing is we can reuse some of the code that we create and eventually put that code into a stored procedures. Entity framework will treat these views as if it were a table, and it's pretty easy to scaffold into .NET projects. First thing we do, we make a database. So follow the steps like you did in the previous tutorials. Finally, click create, and it will take a few minutes to actually create the database. And once it's complete, you can go on to the next step. Here I'm using SQL Server Management Studio to configure the new database that we just created. Mine's called BB Stats. We'll start by creating some of the entities by adding some tables. First table I'm going to make is a player table. I'm going to use the standard conventions by calling the primary key field ID with a capital I and a lowercase d. I'm going to make the data type integer. Don't allow nulls, and I'm going to set that to be the primary key by clicking the little key picture up here. Next, I'd like this to be an auto incrementing value, so I'll make sure this column is selected, and I'll go to the bottom part down here, and I will go to identity, specification, go to is identity, and change that to be a yes. And it will auto increment, and it'll increment by 1 every time. A couple other features you might want to enable in your SQL Server Management Studio settings is right here. If you ever have problems saving a table because it would force it to be recreated, you can change those settings if you so choose. You can do that under Tools, Options, and then go to Designers right here. And then this box right here, prevent saving changes that require table recreation. So you might find some warnings or errors that come up that don't let you do that, and all you have to do is check that box off. Next, we'll put some data fields in here. I'll make something called first name, and the type I'll make it a varchar 50, and I'll make last name. And I won't allow nulls in those fields. And I will save this table like that. And I will call this table players. And you can give it a quick refresh over here if you can't see your tables showing up. Next, we'll make teams. So I'll make a new table, same steps. I'll give it an ID. I'll make it an integer field, make it a primary key, and make it an auto increment. And we'll give this a team name field. And we'll save this table and we'll name it teams. Next, we'll make a table that links players and teams together. We call these linker tables or junction tables. Right? So here we're going to make a new table. We still want only a single ID field. I'm not using composite keys. I'm going to use just a regular integer field, and I will show you how to address keeping a player from appearing on a team twice. So same steps, make that a primary key and set the set the identity to be an auto increment. And here we want to join players and teams together to assign a player to a team. And also in this design, we can have a player play on different teams if that is a scenario that makes sense for you. So I'll keep this as an integer field, and I'll do the same thing for team ID and make an integer field there. Won't allow nulls. For now, I'll save this. I generally like to have the table name saved before I start adding relationships and adding rules. So I'll just save it right now, and I'll call this player teams. Give it a refresh over here. And now we want to put some rules down. So we have a couple rules to do. First of all, we want a foreign key relationship. So player IDs entered into this table must be a primary key in the players table, and same thing for the team. So this team foreign key must be a primary key in the teams table. So we'll make those relationships first. So you can go to the little relationship button here, which is up here at the top, or you can just right click on any area and then just click relationships, right? So let's add a relationship. Okay. And to do this, we just click add right here, and then we're going to expand this little columns and tables area. And then we're going to click on this little 3-dot ellipses here. And then what we want to do is create our relationship. So I start with the primary key. So we'll do the players first. So pick the table that has the primary key, and then pick the field that is the primary key, and that's our ID field here. And then foreign key, obviously you can't change that because we're in this table, but you want to pick the field. Okay, so we want to select player ID in that case. And then right here, you can just give it a name. It tries to name it for you, and that's a reasonable name. FK just means foreign key. So we'll click OK, and we'll keep that. And then it makes a relationship. Let's add one more, and we'll do the same thing. We'll expand this little area here. We'll click the 3 dots. We'll click the primary table. The primary table in this case is teams. So we'll click team ID for that. And the foreign key is just our team ID column here and we'll click OK, and we'll close this, and we'll let this thing save. Okay, so if you get a little message there about not being able to save, you might want to go ahead and do what I said earlier with the tools, allowing this checkbox to be off, prevent saving changes that require recreation. Okay. One of the cool things that Management Studio will do is create diagrams for you, and I'm going to do that. I just click diagrams and expanded it. I'll click yes here, and we can make new database diagram. And if you ever get this silly error, it comes up all the time for me, just close and reopen Management Studio. I don't know what it is and why it does that, but to fix it, I just always close and reopen. So here we have our Management Studio reopened. So I will try this again. I'll expand this, and I'm going to right click, and I'm going to click New Database Diagram, and you just select the tables that you want to add to your diagram. I'll add these. As soon as I close this, it'll make a reasonable attempt to arrange them, and this is what we have so far. Now, it doesn't quite line these things up perfectly, so that's kind of one of the flaws there, but it does a reasonable job of showing you the relationships. So if you want to save it, you can save it when you close this. All right, so let's go back to this table. The one thing we want to do in our player teams is make sure that we don't put the same player on the same team twice. So to do that, we can go in here and we can add an index. Okay, and what we're going to do, we're going to just kind of constrain this, and what we're going to do, we're going to add a new index or key here. So we put add. All right, and then what you want to do over here where it says columns, we can just click the ellipses here, and then you want to just pick the columns, right? So I'm going to pick the combination of player ID and team ID, and then I'll click OK. And then right here, I just want to put a unique constraint on, right? So it will not let me enter in a duplicate combination of the same player ID and team ID. So I'll just make that unique. And if you want to name it something a little better, we can say player teams, call it player team, like unique might be a little bit better name in case we have to figure out what each of these indices will do. So I'll do that, and then I'll just save that, and here we go. Okay, right, so we can kind of go through and test this out a little bit and make sure that our rules are working. So I'm going to open each of these tables by right clicking and doing edit. And once we have the 3 tables open, we'll see them up here. I want to see them all at the same time. So I'm going to just kind of click and drag these into a spot so the windows will split like this. Just do that right there. And here we have it. Okay, let's see. Let me put this one over here, and let me make some players first here, right? So I'll make some players. We're going to make a player called Steven, and his last name is Mole. We'll make another player named Sandy, and his last name will be Marchie. We'll make another player called Greg Spectre, and we'll make one more player called Dexter Muscle. Right, so we just have some arbitrary players that we made. Now let's make some teams. We'll make a team called the Hound Dogs, and we'll make another team called the Pinheads. Now we'd like to assign some of these players to be on some of these teams. So I would come here and I'd say, let's put Stephen Mole, he's player ID 1, on the Hound Dogs. Let's put player ID 2, Sandy, on the Hound Dogs. So we have that relationship. All right, now let's test to see if our rules are working. So I will select a player that doesn't exist, like player 5, and try to put them on team ID 1. And of course we get an error there. So I'll try putting player ID 1 on a team that doesn't exist, say team 100, right? Same thing. I'll try to add player ID 1 to the team again. Again, it says we can't do that. So it looks like our rules are working out okay. So to continue this process, we'll put player ID 3 on team 2. We'll put player ID 4 on team 2. Next, we'll make the concept of a game. And a game is an event that happens on a specific date and time between teams. So we'll follow the same suit. I'll make an ID field. I'll make it an integer. I'll make it a primary key. And I will make it an auto increment field. All right, so you might have a home team and an away team, or our team and an opponent team, whatever it is. So I'll just make something called our team ID. I'll make it an integer. I'll make something called opponent, and we'll also make this an integer. And then we'll put a location, maybe where the event is at. So I'll make this varchar, let's see, we'll make it about 50. And you have to decide if it makes sense to allow it to be null. Sometimes you don't know the exact location, but you want to enter it in and add a location later. So I'll allow nulls for that. And then we have a game date time. So I'll call this date time, game date time. And I'm going to use date time offset. And what a date time offset is, it is a way to store times that are agnostic to any time zones or daylight savings that you may incur. Okay, so it's kind of like a standard time that can be converted into any kind of local time that you want to use. So those are nice to use in databases where we don't want to have issues with time zones and daylight savings and things like that. Okay, once again, before I make these relationships, I like to save this, okay, because if you don't, sometimes when you make the relationships, it's going to want to use this funny default name for a table like FK table 1, and I'd like to just get it named first. So I'm going to name this table games, and then I'll just refresh it over here and I'll open it up again. And I'm going to design it, right? And what we need to do is add a foreign key relationship here. So we'll go to relationships, okay? We'll add a relationship here, and I will choose the columns and the primary table. So the primary table, we want to choose teams, and then we'll have a team ID. And games, we'll do, how about our team first. We'll click OK, and then we'll call this foreign key. I'll call it something like this, right? Just something that you can figure out what relationship does what. And then we'll add another one. This time we'll just select the opponent team ID, and I probably should have named it right then and there, but I can also name it right here. And you can see a little bug here. This doesn't show the same string as it does right there, but I'll save this and we'll see what it does here. Again, if you ever get an error here, make sure you allow it to recreate tables. And let me just go ahead and open this back up and see what we have here in the design view. Let me check my relationships, and it looks okay. I just don't like the way it named them, but good enough there. All right. So at this point, we can kind of add a schedule. Now, for the games, I actually do want to allow duplicates in the team and, our team and opponent, because we might have multiple games against the same team. So it makes sense to have them there, right? I'm not going to worry about restrictions and making our team, opponent team, and game time unique. That, to me, the user can figure out that they duplicate scheduled something, okay? And I'm not going to make the database try to figure out if games overlap or anything like that. I would leave something like that to the application level to do. So I can open this up in Edit, and we see our games here. And what I'll do, I'll make it so I can see all of the tables so far in their data view. And now what we can do, we can add a schedule. And a schedule happens between two teams. So we will assume that we are the Hound Dogs. How about that? So our team ID will be 1, and we're going to play the opponent team 2, and we're going to play them at Madison Square Garden. So I'll just put MSG there. And date time, I will just put any game time here. I'll put 1/1/2024. Maybe it's a New Year's Day game. You can put a time in there if you want. By default, it's going to just set it to midnight UTC. Okay, so UTC is the kind of time that it uses here. And then how about we play them again? And we'll play them at the same spot, but this time it will be on a different day. So let me do this. I'll do 1/5/2024. And now we have the concept of a little schedule going on with some sample data. Okay. So if we would refer back to our diagrams, we'll see that the diagram we have is out of date, right? So you would have to make a new diagram. So these are just snapshots in time of the relational views of your database. Okay. So if you want to make a new one, you can. Let's see if I get that goofy error. Yep, and of course we do. I don't know how to fix it, so I'm gonna restart Management Studio. And once we restart it, we can go and make a new database diagram. Pick the tables you want to add. I'm going to add all of them, add them, close this out, and it makes an attempt to make a diagram for you. You can save this if you want to. Diagram 1 sounds good to me. And now we need to move on to statistics. So we'll make a table that just tracks the type of statistics that we want to track. So I'll make an ID field, I'll make it an integer, I'll make it not null, primary key, and identity field. Bada bing, there we go. And what we'll have the name of the stat right here. I'll call it stat name, and I'll make it hold up to 50. And I'll make that required. And I'll save that. And I will call this stat types, or just give it a refresh. And I'll put a couple example pieces of data in there. All right, so we'll put, how about this? Let's do this actually. I'm gonna add another field. So I want maybe the complete full name of it, and then I want an abbreviated name, maybe to show on my user interface. So I'll make something called stat name abbrev, like that. And maybe we'll make this a lot smaller. We'll make it maybe 5, and we'll force us to put something in there. And I'll open it up in edit view. So here it is in edit view. So maybe the nice full name is 2.made, and I'll call this like 2pt_md or something, or maybe just like that, right? And I'll do 2.miss, and I'll call this 2pt_miss. Let's see, that might be too large. Yeah, so I'll call it 2.ms. How about that? And here I'll do 3.made, call it 3pt like that, and I'll call this 3.miss. Right, so maybe this is what we show as column headers or buttons or something like that, if we don't have a lot of room. All right, so that looks good. Then what we have to do now is have the ability for a user to enter stats, right? So we really need to join up the stat types, right, during a specific game between a player that exists on a specific team, right? So what we want to do is make a table to do that. So we'll make a new table. As usual, we will make an ID field. I'll make it int like we've been doing. I will make it over here. I'll make it an identity, and I'll make it a primary key. And then we need to put some relationships in here. So we want to have the player team ID, because this is a player that exists on a specific team, right? So again, we're just making it a little future proof where a player can exist on a different team. And if we want to look at team stats or something like that, we don't want to confuse it if they play on two different teams, right? So we won't allow nulls there. And for a stat to happen, it has to happen at some point in time, right? Which is a game, right? Which is a contest between two teams on a specific date. So we'll put a game ID here, and then we'll put a stat value. And to be safe, I'm going to make this a decimal number. I'm not going to do floating point numbers. Instead, I'm going to use decimal numbers, which are a base 10 storage. It's slightly slower, but you won't have floating point estimations happen there. And then this 18.0 is the number of decimal points, the number of digits before the decimal. I don't think we'll need that. Honestly, probably 4 would be fine, but you know, I'll allow 8 there, and maybe I'll allow 4 after the decimal point. Okay. So again, before I make these relationships, I'll go ahead and I will save the table so it has a name. And this is called, how about we'll just call this stats right here, and then give it a refresh. And then we'll design this table again so that we can establish the appropriate relationships here. So here's the stat table design. So I'll just go here, I will go to relationships, and then we'll have to add some relationships. So we will go and add the relationships like we've been doing. We'll do the team ID, player team ID first. So I'll check this player team ID table, and then we'll do the ID here, and then our foreign key is player team ID, stat player team ID. That's good enough. I will do the game ID. So we'll do this. We'll do the little dots there. The primary key is game.game ID, and our foreign key is our game ID column there. And now when stats are entered, of course, they can be associated with a specific player that's on a team during a specific game. And we can try to construct a new diagram, although let's see if it's going to let us. Of course not. So I'll restart this again. So we go to diagrams, and I'll make a new diagram. I could certainly delete the other ones. They don't really apply anymore. I'll add all the tables. I'll close this, and it looks like we're missing something here, right? So I forgot to add the stat ID, so the kind of stat we're adding. So we can add a number, but we don't know what it means. We don't know if it's 2 pointers, 3 pointers, whatever. So I will close that. And just looking at this, we could see that we had that little error there. So we will edit this table, this stats table. We'll design it, and we'll add this stat ID. If you want, you can put it here. So I'll just put it at this spot so that we have the value at the bottom. Doesn't really matter, just kind of looks better, right? And I can go ahead and add that relationship now. This table's named, so we're okay. So add that relationship, and we can choose the columns we want. So the primary key is stat type, and it's an ID. And over here, it's going to be stat. I should call this stat type ID. That's going to bother me. So I'm going to just call this stat type ID instead. So we'll try that again. So we'll make our relationships. This was partially added. I'll just delete it. I'll add this thing and make our relationship. So it's stat types dot ID, and it is stat type ID. And I'll close this. I'll save it. I may as well not even try to make a database diagram right away, because I know it's probably going to make me restart it. Oh wow, it didn't make me do it. Maybe because I didn't save the last diagram. I don't know. So we'll just go ahead and add these tables in. We'll let it make its best effort to arrange these, and it looks okay. It's kind of interesting the way it looks. I'd probably put it more like this, something like that, rather than the one on top, but it doesn't matter. This is just, you know, for visualizing or whatever. And there we have it, right? Now, of course, know that these things don't really matter where that goes, so ignore that, the location of that. All right, so I'm not going to save this, and then I don't really care about those right now, so I will delete these, and I'll delete this one as well. All right, so let's open up all of these tables again, just to add some sample data to make sure our rules work and that it makes sense. So we'll open up all these. See, I'll put games over there. I'll just open them all. I'll arrange them in a second. All right. So we have this. I'm going to put the actual stats all the way on the right. So I'm going to put it way over here on the right. That's stat types. I want the actual stats over here on the right. So I'll do that. I'll move this one over here. Right. Okay. I'll put games next to it. I'll put our players way over here on the left. I'll put our teams there. And I'll put this one, how about right here? All right. So we can kind of look at the flow here. What we want to do is just try adding a couple stats to make sure that they make sense. All right, so let's try adding a stat in here. So we'll pick a game. So we'll just do this very first game right here that is between these two teams on January 1st. So I'll put that game ID of 1 there. And we'll pick a stat type. We'll say that it's a 2-point made. So that's stat ID 1. And there's a couple ways we can do this. We can keep editing a record here. So as a person keeps making 2 pointers, we could constantly keep adding to this value as they get to them, or we can keep adding records and accumulate them. It's probably a little easier to do editing as far as some of your queries, because then you don't have to do some grouping and aggregating and summing. But I'm going to add one record at a time and then sum them so that I could almost have a historical view of the events that happened in a game. I could certainly timestamp those or whatever, but I can go and see actually what happened. And I could see that they first did a 2-point make, and then they did a 2-point miss, then they did a 2-point make, right? And I have all of those kind of separately. So I'm going to do that and assume I'll just put ones there. And then the player team ID. Now, notice that it is going to make us pull from this player team ID. So we have to pick one of these here. Now, technically, I could break this if I would pick a player team that really didn't play in that game. So it would kind of not make sense for me to put player ID 4, right? I'm sorry, that's not 4, it's actually 7. How about player team ID 7? So it doesn't make sense, that I would put that in there. But the database really isn't forcing that. So that would be something you have to enforce at that level, unless you want to make your database design much more complex. I don't want to do that, so I'm just going to put some valid records in here. So this player team ID 1, I know this game and player are kind of linked together. All right, so let's do this. Let's add another one. We'll say that the same person in the same game had a 2-point miss, one of those. 2-point miss is ID 3, sorry. All right, and then we'll say the same player in the same game had another 2-point make right here. So I'll add 1 there. And we'll do this. We'll say this player in this game had a 3-point make, which is ID 4 right there. And it looks like there we go. Just refreshing this one here. All right, so here is some stuff that happened for a specific player in a game. Right now, I will put some in for our other player in that game. So we have player ID 1 and team ID 1 for this guy. So I will pick this one here. It's the other player on our team. Essentially, Stephen Mull is the person that made all these stats. So we want to do Sandy, who's also on our same team. So we want team ID 1, player ID 2, right? And that gives us this 2 here. So we'll put this guy in here. It's in the same game. And we'll say that they had a 2-point make. We'll do that. We'll do the same player in the same game. Now they'll make a couple 3-pointers. We'll put one in there. And I'm sorry, that's not ID 3, it is ID 4. Okay, so you can see a 3-pointer make is that ID. So I'll add a couple of these in, right? Maybe they made another one. They got on a pretty good streak here, right? So we see this stuff here. It's failing to add those records. So what we can do, just execute it, refresh, and see if that records actually get inserted correctly. Right now, of course, we see that we have these stats. Unfortunately, they're not very viewable at all to the user. Generally, the user wants to see things aggregated up into a nice viewable display that makes sense for someone to read. This doesn't make sense for someone to read. And there's lots of ways we can do that. And we'll talk about that next. So one of the approaches we can take is to create views. And what views are kind of virtual views of combined tables. So it almost lets you have a query that can be accessed as if it were a table. And I'll show you how to do a couple of those right here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to make a new view. All right. And maybe what we want to do for a view is just have a nice team roster, right? So we could say, all right, let me see all the people on our team, right? Or all the people on our teams or something like that. So I'll just add player teams right now, right? And when we look at this, if we just show all of these columns and we let this thing run, we get this down here. Again, that's terrible for a user to view that, right? So we really want to know the name of the player and what team they're on. So we need to join those tables. So of course we could join in using SQL here and do some joins. I'm just going to do this quickly by adding another table and say, let's look at the player names. Okay, so now if I add the player name fields, right, now it's starting to look reasonable, right? And then we want the team names. I don't want to see team ID 1 and team ID 2. I want to see things like the pinheads or whatever, right? So we'll add that one, and I'll say that I want to make sure that that is displayed, right? And this is what we have, right? So we can essentially pass this through an API to our client. This data may or may not be useful. I don't know. It doesn't hurt to send it. The user interface does not have to show it, but we could certainly send it if we want. If we don't want to send it, we can just turn some of these IDs off, right? And get something like this, right? Or get rid of, not show these player IDs, whatever, right? And we get this kind of look here. Now this looks nice, right? Now, if we want to show the players only for the hound dogs or only for the pinheads, we could do it at this level, or we could do it at the API level, or we could do it at the client level. Just depends. It's a little bit hard to pass parameters into views. That's one of the downsides. And the other part is we don't really edit data in a view. Okay, so we're not going to edit a team name, or we're not going to change somebody's last name, or we're not going to remove somebody from a team here, because a view is simply like a logical view of a query. But in any case, I can put some of these IDs in. Now if we do select names that are the same, like ID, we would have to alias them here, right? So that we don't have a bunch of the same column names, ID. It just by default says expression 1, expression 2. But here you can choose this. You could say, I have to even see what this one is. This is player ID. This next one is team ID. So these are a little bit better names here, right? You can run that again and get something like this. So I'll close this and we'll call this team rosters. How's that? All right, now how about if we ever wanted to show a schedule? Well, we would want to show all of the games. And again, when we look at it in this format, it's not very useful because we don't see the team names in here, right? So you could make a view for that. And let me refresh this. So maybe what I do here is add the games just to start, right? And we would definitely want to see this stuff. Well, right now I'll just put the IDs in there and we see it's not very user friendly. We would like it to look up the teams, right? So we'll add the table that has the team details in it. We'll do this and we'll put a team name there. All right, now this one's kind of weird because it needs to put 2 teams, but let's go ahead and run this, right? And here it looks kind of funky, right? Because it doesn't know how to figure that thing out here. All right, so one way we can do this is we can remove one of these relationships like this. Just remove one of those, run it again, and then we see that it lists one of the team names. I have to see which one it's doing. It is, let's see, this one is joining on the opponent team. So this is the opponent team name here, right? So I would probably do something like this. I would call this opponent, right? And then this might look a little bit better. And then if we want to print the complete list of, you know, team 1 versus team 2 or whatever, you can add this back in here, add this table back in, right? And again, we get this kind of goofy view, and we need to kill this duplicate relationship here just for viewing purposes, right? And this line, I'm just clicking on this line. This is our team, and this little bottom one is the opponent. So I will get rid of this opponent one, which is this bottom one, right? I'll put this team name here, and I will go ahead and execute that. And now we see all of the matchups, right? So you can just, this would normally be like home and away or something if you were doing a website to show the whole league or something like that. But for us, you know, if it's just one user and it's not really for a whole league, this would be our team or something, whatever. Right, so we're acting as if we are the hound dogs here, right? So this would like maybe help show a list of all games that we played. Now, again, ones that we played, assuming we only enter games in for us, then this would be fine. But if we enter in games where we are not always our team and other people can use this, then you would probably have to have a little filter here or where clause, or you can just send it all back and do that in the API layer, whatever. So remember, this is a very simplified view of how to aggregate data. So I'll just call this schedule. And what we really care about is the list of stats. All right, so again, you could really go to town on this, but you know, just looking at this, we see that this is not in a very viewable format, right? This is very hard to read, right? Even going through a tutorial, it's very hard to go and associate back to game IDs and player team IDs and stat type IDs, right? So, you know, there's a couple kind of statistics we can do. We can just do the raw statistics. That's kind of easy to read, and we'll start with that. And then we'll go to aggregate statistics, where we kind of add some things up. Okay, so I'll make another view, and I always start out with the main table I want. I want to look at stats, right? So I'm going to add that. And usually I just kind of take a look, and you know, we have the value here. We could certainly put these things in, but it's going to be very hard to read. All right, so one of the things I'd love to see is the actual type of statistic we have. So I would add a stat type here, like this. And I'd want to see, I don't know, I'll put both of these, the name and the abbreviation for now, right? And now we can at least see what the raw statistic was, right? Now we have the problem, I don't know who it is because it's a relationship with this player team ID, all right? So we can add this. Now I want to see the player, right? I can do this, all right, and we'll see if this makes any sense, right? Now notice this relationship doesn't look like one-to-many here, right? If we say I want to see who that is and run it, now you notice that our stats disappeared, right? Looks like a lot of stats disappeared, and the reason is this stat doesn't have a player ID here, okay? It's actually going through the player team relationship. So we don't want to add this thing in like this. It's just kind of guessing for us, and it's doing a join. Look, this does not make any sense right here. It's trying to do a join on stat ID equals player ID. That makes absolutely no sense. So delete this relationship there, right? And now we get this crazy thing here, right? It's doing completely wrong stuff. So I'll show you how to do this correctly here. All right, so kind of back to where we started, right? We have, let's see, let me make sure we have that many stats. Let me view the raw table here. It looks like we have 8 statistics entered there, and we have 8 here. Okay, so that looks okay. So you don't want to make a funky relationship there. So we really need to go through our player team relationship like this, all right? And then we need to go through our players to properly get them. And now it's not trying to make a weird relationship from players into here, okay? And what I really like is the player name next to each of these. So we do that, and now we have the beginnings of like raw statistics here. So I don't know if it makes sense to, if you want to show a particular game, you may or may not want to, but you know, this is showing all the stats for all the people throughout all the games, right? So that's a start, all right? So you could certainly save this and call this like all raw stats or something like that. And I'm just gonna copy this view I made just so I don't have to put those things back in there. No, I'm not. I'm gonna just create it again actually. So here I'll add these back in. I'm gonna add, now this is what can happen here. If I add stat type and stats and player teams and players and hope for the best, let's see what happens, right? So if we do this and execute, right, oh, we have to put some data in here, sorry. Right, we want the stat name, we want the actual stat value, and now we'll try this. And it gives us those 8 we had, right? I did not click first name, and I didn't click abbreviation for some reason. So we'll try that again. And this is kind of where we were just at. All right, so what do we do when we want to kind of accumulate these things up? We kind of have to do some aggregation here so we can do some summations of these particular fields, right? So we can see that, let's see, I don't like the order of this. Let me change this order and put the first name and last name together, at least so I can see them. So Stephen Mole had some 2 pointers, right? So what we'll do, we'll try to aggregate this data up. So if you want to start aggregating some data up, you need to write some aggregation functions like summing, right? And what I'm doing is I'm just summing the total number of 2 points made, and I'm doing the total number of 3 points made. So I'm just simply adding up the type of statistics that get accumulated, like points and fouls and attempts and misses and mades and things like that. I'm just doing it for a couple of the columns here, And what we would have to do is group them. And this would show the data per game. And I'll show you this here in a second. So if we go and add another game, let's look. I think we have a couple games. We have 2 different games, but our stats only, let's see. So looking at our raw data from our all raw stats, we can see that Sandy Marchi has made a total of 11 points, right? So he has a 3, 3, 3, and a 2. And these were spread across 2 different games, right? So we would want all the stats of a particular game in some cases to see how we did in a game, and we would want our kind of season stats, which would be all of the stats for a player. So we can kind of come back here and we can look and see that something fishy is going on here, right? So when we start aggregating these, we're not really being specific on how we want these things to aggregate up. So right now it's giving our season statistics, right? So we can see that he has three 3-pointers and 1 2-pointer to give us 9, right? But we said those were spread across 2 different games here, right? So, you know, we could save this view if we want as season stats, right? It gives all players. Now, again, if we want to send more data to try to help, you know, the API or the front end, you might want to put in ID fields in here, right? So we don't want the, you know, we don't want them to try to filter on someone's first name or last name. We would want to put the player ID in there, right? So maybe it makes sense to put the player ID in there, right? Maybe it makes sense to put the game ID if we need to separate by game IDs, right? It'll still give us the same data back, but now we have this data in case something down the stream needs to query it with a little bit stronger types there. So I'll just save this one as it is here. So here we have it divided up by games. So we can see that Sandy Marchi scored 1 2-pointer in this game and no 3-pointers in this game. And then on the game that happened here, we can see that Sandy Marchi scored 0 2s and 3 3-pointers in that game. So here all I do is just do a little bit of multiplication to sum up the total points in each game, right? So we see Sandy Marchi, the game on this date, you know, you could add whatever fields make sense. And then we can see that I made 1 2-pointer in that, I'm sorry, not me. This great basketball player, Sandy Marchi, made 1 2-pointer. So they have a total of 2 points in that game. And then on this game, they made 3 3-pointers. So they have a 9-point game on that day. Okay, and this divides it up per game. So you could certainly query this game ID, and if you needed to see a specific person, I would probably add in the player ID. So I'd have to find it. I think it's this one right here. It's an ID, and I would probably just alias it and call it player ID, right, like that, and just go here, and now we can have the player ID there, right? So given a game, given a player, I can show summary statistics, and I can even add them up. It's pretty cool. Now, normally you want to do this in stored procedures, but it is a little bit more of a learning curve to do that. One advantage of stored procedures is that they will run faster, and we can also send in parameters. However, getting them to work correctly with Entity Framework is a little bit more challenging. So this is more like a step to get things in what we would call like a data model, a view model, right? This is something that a screen would want. So I'll save this view and I will call it player game stats, something like that. I just erased it, son of a gun. I'll make it again. So this is player game stats. Oh, that's okay. So now we need to think about getting this into a web API. So I'll make a new project. I'm starting with a web API first, and then I'll maybe add a front end later. I'm using 7 and I am using Swagger, so I'll put this open API support on. And just as a sanity check, I will just run this, and it looks like we're pretty good here. All right, so a little hello world works okay. So what we want to do is make sure that we can connect to this database, and we can go ahead and get some object mapping done. So I will just add a couple of dependencies here. So I'll go to the new Git package manager here. I will do some browsing, and I will add in I'll search for entity framework, and we'll add the core. I'll make sure that it is in this project. Actually, I want to change this name right now to API project. So you can use what version makes sense. I would probably stick with 7 or 8. Okay, so I'm sticking with 7 right now. So I'll install this to the API project. So just go through this procedure of getting your entity framework stuff set up, and I'm just running it just to make sure some of these packages get installed correctly. Go ahead and create a secrets.json file with your connection strings. Go ahead and make sure that entity framework is installed, and mine's already installed. Go ahead and scaffold out your models. So the first time I got an error, but I just built my project because my secrets file wasn't really incorporated into the project until you build it. So those little nuances happen. And so I just scaffolded this out, and then I get a bunch of models. Notice that I get the models of the raw tables, and I also get the models of things like season stats. So let's start by just making some controllers for our raw data tables, right? So I can go ahead and make a controller, and I'll make an API, and I'll just do, how about players? So players would be this thing right here, and then I'll add this. Okay, so we get this error because it does not know about our entities here. So we can fix that by going into the program.cs file here. Let me fix this. I'm gonna have to do this again because I forgot to add it. So we'll just go ahead and add this DB context here. So I'll just go to builder.services, add a DB context. I forget what ours is called. Ours is called BB stats context right here. And once we add that, we should be able to scaffold out. Okay, I'm gonna build it once just to get the project up to date in case it needs to make any references to this. So I'll scaffold this out, this API, and we were doing player. Okay. So I'll do this player, and I'll choose that contacts, and I'll make that, and that gives us an API for players, and we'll run it as soon as it's done. Okay, so here we have it. I'll run this one. I'll just go to the get right here, and we'll just get all of them. All right, and it looks like we have this going on, and let's see. It's giving us a list of teams as well. We don't necessarily have to have that. It just tried to do us a favor here, right? So we can see why it did that. When it created this, it made a list of teams. So I really don't want that at that point. So I'm just gonna resave my model there. So you have to be careful if you end up regenerating. You might want to, at some point in time, be a little bit careful about blindly recreating all models every time, but I can do that. Now when I go to my player controller, all right, it should not include that data in there, but let's see what it does. All right, so in my context, I'm just gonna go ahead and get rid of this thing as well. Okay, it's where it maps a team, so I'm just gonna get rid of that. Then I'll go ahead and run it. And now when I do get players, right, I can go ahead and get just the players. Okay, so, you know, sometimes it scaffolds it the way you want and sometimes it doesn't. Okay, so anytime I'm going to rescaffold, I might want to be a little bit careful. So if you want to scaffold out a particular table only or a particular view, you can specify that. So I'll get rid of this player controller and we'll just remake it here. So all this stuff looks good. Saw this controller, try it again. All right, this is a very simple one. It's just a player controller. All right, we'll run this and we'll do get all players and we can see the schema looks a little better now. And we'll run this and we get all of our players. So there's that one, good. We can make another one to get all the teams. We'll just make a couple here, right? We'll make something so we can manage teams. We'll make something so we can assign players to teams. So here's the team one. Just go through these, make them out, and then we'll make the one that lets us assign players to teams. So we'll make a new controller. Okay, this is player team, right? And we probably want one so that we can enter statistics in. So we would need the one for posting statistics. So we'll make the stat one there and we'll test these out just in Swagger for now. Looks like they generated okay. We can get a list of all the teams, see how that looks. That looks good. We only have 2 teams. And once again, looking at teams here, we're okay. These are just foreign key relationships. All right, so you can see here the data model, the way it's scaffolded, it's trying to put these lists in here. So again, if it makes sense, you can just go into your model class that it generated and say, I don't really like the way it did it, and you can simply delete those if you want to. Just be careful if you make any modifications, you might have to manually, change the way you scaffold and not reforce everything and just pick the tables that you want to rescaffold. So of course, if you run this, it's going to break, right? Because there's no entity where we have a list of opponents. So I just go and I just get rid of those, right? Right, and we get rid of this one as well. And now when we get, let's see, a list of teams, we just get kind of the raw team data here, right? So we have 2 teams. Let's look at our other ones. Let's look at players. Players looks okay. Now let's look at player teams. Okay, so once again, we don't really need this all inside here. We kind of are taking a different approach. So we're going to get rid of stats and teams from this data model. So here's player team. We don't want to have a double lookup that way. So we'll get rid of that. All right. You can try to run it, but of course it's going to fail because we're going to be referring to these fields somewhere. So we run this and we can see that it doesn't build. So let's just get rid of that relationship there. All right. And now when we go to player teams, we can simply get the player teams, right? And say that we have a very simple structure here, right? Good. All right. Now the next thing, how to look at some of these views that we made. So we have this team roster view, right? So let's make a controller for that. So we have, whoops, let me stop this. So we're going to go ahead and make a controller for this. And this was a team roster right here. So this is going to be a view that we're looking at, right? So you see right here, it says there's an error creating this because we have no primary key. Okay, so this is a view here. Okay, so it complains that we don't have a primary key. All right, so if we look at this and we see the way we're scaffolding, it says that we're making create, read, updates, deletes for this, right? And we get this primary key not found, and it really wants primary keys so that it can be able to pass around unique records and edit unique records. And remember, this is a view. We don't really have all the CRUD operations for a view. We really only have reading operations for a view. Okay, so it's really not able to automatically scaffold that out for us. So what we can do instead is say, well, let's just make our own controller here, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to make our own controller. This one's going to be called the team roster controller. All right, now you see we get this kind of blank slate to make a controller here, right? We can run this and we can see what we have here, right? We don't really have any endpoints for that, right? So we can go and kind of look at another piece for a baseline here. So let's look at another controller here. I'm going to just go ahead and open up one we made. How about this player controller? Okay. So we don't need everything in here. We just need a getter, right? So let's take a look here. You can see that we have to have our context in here. So in the constructor, it sets the context, right? The context is the whole thing that maps the objects to the database tables. So we'll just copy and we'll paste this thing in here, right? And make sure you change the name of the constructor here like that, okay? And what else do we need? Well, this will get all of the players. This one will get a specific, right? So let's start with this one here. Let's just copy this one and paste this one in here. So obviously it's not called get API players. All right, let's get rid of that. We don't want a list of player. We want a list of what? Well, what's going to be our model class, right? I think it was the roster, right? Team roster right here. So we want a list of this thing right here. Okay. So don't do a player, and it doesn't really matter what you call this function. Like get players is a good name or get rosters is a good name, but it really lets you have one of these in here and doesn't matter. But I'll call it get, what is this? Get team roster. Something like that. Context players, we don't want that. This would be team rosters, right? Not found is just how you want to handle this, which is okay. So we're going to do context.team rosters. All right, and then we'll run this. Okay, and let's see. Now we have a getter for the team roster. So let's see if that works okay. Okay, so it looks like we have all the rosters, right? So that's good. So this isn't really used to like edit team rosters. This is used for a visual display that shows a friendly name of a person rather than a player ID, and a friendly team name, right, rather than a team ID, right? But we do have those in case we want to go and click on one of those or go to a detail page. I know the ID of the person right there. I know the ID of the team right there. So we are golden. All right, let's do another one. How about the, how about, actually, let me do this. That shows all of the rosters, right? But what if we want the roster of a specific team? Okay, so if you look here, you say, look, this thing gets me a specific player, right? So I could make something that says, get me a specific roster for a specific team. So I'll just paste this thing, right? And you can see we're just passing something in here. So we don't want this. We're going to overload this function, but we're going to pass an ID. And it's not players, it's team rosters. If you want to update those comments, we're still going to get a list of team rosters, right? We're going to do this here. All right. Now, let's see, that's plural. Sorry, team rosters. And what are we going to do? We're going to get a specific roster, right? All right. And we can probably put a better name here instead of just ID. We can just say, you know, team ID, something like that. All right. Now, this isn't really going to help us here. What we want to do is this. Let's go. We want to make sure we're looking only at the team field, right? So we can use something called LINQ, and what we're going to do is this. We're going to go ahead and grab these. We're just going to do toList async. I'll keep on screwing that up. Sorry, it's toList async. Okay, now this would be all rosters, right? So what if we want the rosters just for a specific team. So we'll do that here. Okay, so what we'll do, we'll filter it down here. I'll just call this team roster, and we'll say that it's all rosters. And what we're going to do, LINQ is kind of like a way we can do kind of a query language here at the application level, and it works by using kind of its own syntax, and it's kind of in reverse order. So again, this is called LINQ, and it stands for link to SQL. But I'm just going to say .where. You need to come up with like a little temporary variable name. Most people just use X, right? We'll say we're X dot, and then we can just do filtering here. You know, we can do where the, we can do .where team ID equals the team ID we passed in. Okay, something like this, okay? And this would return, it should return 1. Right, so this is what the collection of team rosters look like, and we're trying to only get these records, maybe number 1 or team ID 2. So we still want to get a list back. So up here, we definitely want to have a list. Notice that this says IEnumerable. All right, so we kind of have to go one step so we get a list here. So throw that IEnumerable in there, right? That's just basically saying it's a list. And then right here, we do, we can do to list, right? Just convert that to a list like this. And then we can return that team roster, right? But we're gonna have to pass a team ID in. The current teams we have are team 1 and team 2, right? So we can run this and see if it works. So let's see, here is give me all of the people on all of the teams essentially, which may not be very useful, all right? Or we can come down here and say, give me, oh, we can get rid of that. Hold on, it's this one. I have a bug in here. I have team ID and ID. Okay, so you can see I was kind of fighting right there. I'm saying in the get request, it's called ID, and over here I was inconsistent. So what I'll do, I'll just put this team ID there, right? Just so it's clear, and then we'll run this again. So now we can see it makes a little bit more sense. It's a little bit more readable, and then it makes us so we only have one parameter. So I can say, give me all of the people on the roster on team 1, and we see these people are all on the hound dogs. And then we go here and we run this and we say these people are all on the pinheads, right? Now we can do maybe one, how about some statistics, right? So that was rosters. So let's make a controller for statistics. So I will add a controller. Again, I'm gonna just save the time and I'm gonna do it manually because I know I'm not going to be able to scaffold into a SQL view, right? So I'll just make an empty controller. I might not need all of these controllers I make. We could always delete them or disable them or whatever. But what I'll do, I'll call this, let's see, I think we did season stats. So we'll do that, season stats. And this might be one where we want to show it by person or by team or by game or something like that. So I'll just start it by doing season stats. I guess season stats by game doesn't make sense, but I'll do season stats. All right, so here we are. Here's our start. So probably what we can do, I'm just gonna copy and paste some stuff from my team roster, right? And I'm gonna paste this constructor in here. I do need to change the name of the constructor, right? So there we have that. And then let's see, here's a getter, and this would get team rosters is not a good name. We would want get all stats or something like that. Don't even pass anything in. Let's not get team rosters, right? We want to get to see what our model is called. Looks like, you know, either, I think we're doing season stat right there, okay? So we'll do season stat, okay? And then we'll get all of the season stats, right? Make sure that context makes sense. Make sure this context makes sense. And this is called season stats plural. So the way it named it was plural there, but my entity is singular, right? So we would want to get that so it matches this return type. Okay, so we finish this up and get pretty much all of the stats here. Okay, and this would be, like all the season stats, whatever you want to call it. So we come here, and I think it's this one. So we'll try this out, and it looks like we have some pretty cool aggregated data. So looking at our raw data here, our season stats, we have 3 records, right? And it's aggregated up and giving me total 2 points made and total 3 points made. And this is per game, right? So we look here and we can see that the game ID varies. So this is per game, right? So if we want all the games, fine. If we want a specific game, we can pass it in. If we want a specific player in a specific game, we can pass that in. All we have to do is make more endpoints, right? So maybe we do this and we say, let's see, we're still going to get this back. Let's do get stats and let's pass in int player ID. And you can see why we want to have, a unique identifier for all these, right? So what we do is just kind of copy the same syntax here, right, that we did before. And we'll make sure that these match up. So this is get all stats by player ID, right? That tells us internally what it does. And what we need to do is just filter this here. So this is copied and pasted from the other one, and I don't want team roster. This is player stats, right? Right, and I'll call this var. I'll call this all stats, right? And we're gonna do kind of something similar here. We're gonna say all stats is, we'll say season stats here. And what I'll do, I'll say all stats dot where x dot, what are we doing? Player ID. Player ID equals the player ID that I pass in. Okay, now this is the reduced one here. So we want to return player stats to list like this. Or we can just actually do it here and put the to list right here instead. We don't need to await this, so it's complaining about that because there's no asynchronous call right there. We just need to return it. Okay, so now we can see, can I get the stats by a player? And I need a semicolon here. Right, so here's season stats, right, which I called it that. All right, so let's look at that so I can test this data out here. I'll just leave this one here. So I should be able to get, let's see, how about just player 1 and then we'll try player 2. So player 1 played in 1 game and player 2 played in 2 games. So we'll come out here, we'll say player 1 and we'll get that data and it looks like we get 1 record back, right? So Stephen Mole is good. Now let's get player 2, he should have 2 records returned. So run this again with player 2. And now we get 2 records returned. Now, what if we want it by a specific game? Well, I'm just going to copy and paste this again. Or, let's see, you can get it by just game. You can get it by game and player both. But let's do this. Let me just do game ID. All right, we'll pass this in. We'll call it game ID. We'll change this to get stats by game ID. Here's all of our stats, and I'm just going to say, let's only get it where our game ID equals some game ID here. And it's fine, it's still player stats. So again, we can do this. We can test this out, and here's the one by game ID. I think the game IDs are number 1 and 2. Let's see. No. Oh, I think it's called ID. Hold on. Game ID. Oh. So we overloaded this wrong here, okay? So basically, we're saying I have a get request called, I have a get request, and I have a get request here. We said it doesn't matter what we call this right here, and our problem is we have two of these passing the same kind of field in there, right? So this is an overloading problem, right? So when we run this, we're going to see that it doesn't know which one of these to call, right? And if we even go here, right, we see this one is gonna break now, right? And now the other one breaks. So I broke these, right, because it doesn't know which of these to call. So in that case, you can pass things in the URL, or we need a different endpoint name here. All right, so since these pretty much look exactly the same, where we have this controller slash some integer ID number, we want to decorate it a little better like this, and so these two don't fight each other. So I'm just going to change this one to say player, and then we'll pass the player ID. And then this one, I'm going to change this and say, all right, let's change this to game / game ID, something like that. Now these have two different endpoints, so they're not exactly the same. So now when we run this, we'll test them both out. Okay, so here's all of the stats. Let's try it. We're good, right? We get all of them. Okay, let's try to get it by player ID. We have player ID 1 and 2, right? So we'll do this. We'll say, give me everything for player ID 1. We get it. Give me everything for player ID 2. We get it. And down here, we'll filter it by a game ID. Give me everything for game 1. Give me everything for game 2, right? So there we have that. Perfect.